It was kind of like an acrobat spinning plates as he was going through those last few laps, and it's what made his drive ultimately so impressive.
Hi everyone, I'm Olivia, and this week I'm joined by team representative Bradley Lord, answering all your questions from the Bahrain Grand Prix on this week's Akkodis Debrief. Bradley, welcome to the Akkodis Debrief.
Thank you very much, my first time.
It's amazing to have you here. We're just getting all these new experts in 2025. Now, before we crack on into our fan questions, you've just landed from Bahrain, an amazing race, that incredible drive from George leading to a P2, and Kimi, maybe not the race that he wanted, but still some unbelievable overtaking from our rookie. What was the feeling like leaving that track? How is the team feeling?
It was, as it often is, a bit of mixed feelings, to be honest. Absolutely delighted with George. I think we saw him put in probably one of the best drives we've ever seen him have in Formula One. He was so composed and so sure-footed with all those problems he had with the car in the second half of the race, actually, and yet didn't put a single wheel wrong while juggling a number of different things that were going on in the cockpit. So incredible drive from him. For Kimi, a more difficult race, as you said. It started a little bit on the back foot, and then from there we tried some different things on the strategy that the safety car kind of thwarted a little bit, and maybe some of our decision making wasn't quite as sharp as it could have been. So super frustrating to be P11 and just outside the points, but also, we were after the race and sort of talking through with him, reminding ourselves this is only his fourth Grand Prix, and a difficult result is also part of the learning curve, and no doubt will be brilliant for his experience as we head into Jeddah next weekend.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so much learning from him as well. But we'll start off our fan questions the way that we start off our race weekends with FP1. Now, with Fred, how was that free practice session for him, considering the tricky conditions for everyone? And was the team happy with the data that he brought in?
Yeah, I think first of all, it's worth saying it was brilliant to see Fred back in the car. He obviously had half a day at the Abu Dhabi Young Driver Test last year, but because we were preparing Kimi for his race drive this season, it meant Fred actually didn't pick up the FP1 sessions last year. So he didn't get a chance to show what he can do on a race weekend. So great to have him back with the team and in the car. And we gave him a real challenge. He'd been preparing in the simulator, and we'd sort of based the sim running off what we'd encountered in winter testing. Relatively cool track, nice high levels of grip. And then suddenly he gets in the car, it's over 40 degrees on track, and the circuit's like 5 seconds off, so the grip levels were completely different, and that was a bit of a shock to the system for him, but he did a really good job to adapt. You could see him just finding his feet and then putting in some solid and competitive lap times, and he was able to get through all the programs. So he's done, I think, over 16,000 kilometers in W16 in the simulator. So it's a really important opportunity for the guys who are in the sim to get in the car, to correlate what is happening in the virtual world with how it actually feels in the real world. And that is not just great exposure for Fred and a great chance for him to show what he can do, but also really useful learning to bring back here to Brackley, to the sim team who are working on that tool all the time, and helps us just continue improving that as well.
Absolutely, because Fred is obviously a part of how we set up the car throughout the race weekends, because he's working on the simulator back here in the factory. So you're saying that having that free practice session helps the way that he feeds back in the sim?
How he feeds back, but also he can sort of comment on, right, this feels different in the sim, or this isn't quite as accurate as it needs to be, or we're overestimating this part of the car's performance, and the tyres aren't quite doing this, they're doing this. And all of that is sort of irreplaceable feedback to then feed back into the engineers who are working on the physics and the models behind the scenes to make sure the sim is absolutely as realistic as possible. And as you say, when he's one of the sort of suite of drivers that do the race support from Friday into Saturday overnight, and again, it just gives him a much better feel for the car and what it's doing, and hopefully helps sharpen the inputs that then get received back at track on Saturday morning.
Now on to the race itself. You did touch on this a little bit. There were some technical issues, so George wasn't just battling it out with Lando in that final stint of the race. He was dealing with some problems with the car. So what exactly happened in those final 10 laps, and is there any way to avoid it in the future?
First thing to say is, probably from the TV broadcast, it sounded like the final 10 laps. Actually, it was from about half distance that we had the first sign of a problem. So the first thing that happened, and it's worth saying, we haven't got the root causes yet. So we've just arrived back in the factory with about 10 different suitcases of parts and items that we're bringing back, including a pretty frazzled and sort of charred looking FOM timing transponder, and then some other bits of kit as well related to the brake-by-wire system. So we haven't got root causes yet, but what we know is that we lost the timing transponder just before half distance, actually. And so suddenly there was one lap where we were like, what's going on? Because George's name just plummeted down the timesheets, and we were kind of thinking, okay, no, he's still on track, he's still talking on the radio, so there's a timing issue here rather than something else. But what that also had as a knock-on effect is if you lose the timing transponder, you lose the part of the car that interacts with the DRS mechanism. So for activating DRS, for knowing whether you're within a second or another car is within a second of you. We therefore had to resort to a backup system. So we talked to the FIA, we get permission to do that, and then George is effectively operating the DRS system in manual mode. At the same time, we started to have a separate but parallel problem with the brake-by-wire. So that's the electronics that determine the braking force between front and the rear brakes, but particularly on the rear brakes, there's the chunk of braking that is done by the MG UK, so the electric motor on the engine, and then the chunk done by the hydraulic braking system. And so when we go into what we call passive mode, you're just relying on those hydraulic brakes, but it changes the car's behavior under braking, and ultimately it's very, very difficult to run the car like that because you're just losing a lot of braking force and you ultimately overheat those much smaller hydraulic rear brakes. So George was battling with that. We had to do what's called a default change for him so that he could toggle in and out of that brake-by-wire when it went to passive and put it back in the active mode in those last 10 laps. So I think over those last 10 laps, he was making sort of between 20 and 30 changes to that setting as he was also driving, hitting his braking points and keeping first Leclerc and then ultimately Lando behind him as well. So incredible sort of acrobatics, I guess, at the wheel. But in parallel, we had this DRS problem. And we didn't know what further knock-on effects it might have. And the big fear was that it would knock out the dashboard completely, so the whole steering wheel display. If that happens, we can continue driving because there are fail-safe and backup systems in the car that mean we can still change gear, we can still use the DRS, and we can still use the radio. And so we have a backup radio system in the car that isn't located on the steering wheel, it's a button down in the cockpit. That button, as it turns out, is also the backup and the manual backup for the DRS if that fails. And so George was cycling through a practice to go to the backup radio just in case it was needed, press that backup radio button, and inadvertently on the back straight also open the DRS because it does the two things at the same time. He realized it within an instant, braked, closed the DRS and continued. That's when we heard him come on the radio. That was what the stewards looked at and investigated and ultimately decided there was no further action for it after the race. So yeah, it was kind of like an acrobat spinning plates as he was going through those last few laps, and it's what made his drive ultimately so impressive, not just to have the mental bandwidth to cope with that, but also to be doing the driving, making no mistakes, fending off Lando, keeping Leclerc out of striking distance as well. It was a really incredible performance.
It's amazing to think about how much they're actually doing throughout the races, not just battling the cars around them, but having to input all these codes from their engineers that they're being given. So just amazing from George. But also with that post-race investigation, they didn't find that he had any advantage. Is that why there was no penalty given?
Yeah, there's precedent ultimately. So we saw back in 2018 in Baku, a number of cars had to manually activate DRS because there was a problem with the timing transponder, and you do get some anomalies when that happens, and it was decided back then that there was no further action because ultimately it was an unusual situation and no advantage was gained. And then it was very similar, and actually I think there was after the race footage of Leclerc who had a similar problem with the transponder, his DRS open coming through turn 12 as well, which would certainly catch your attention as a driver, but obviously shows just some of the challenges of managing those complex manual situations when the automatic systems fail.
It's incredible to hear all of the inner workings of it. But we're going to move on to our favorite topic of all on the Akkodis Debriefs, and that is tires. So in that final pit stop, why did we choose to switch onto the soft tires instead of the mediums?
That's a really simple answer. We didn't have any mediums left. So we went into qualifying with 5 sets of softs, 1 medium and 1 hard tire. So thinking as a baseline plan, we were likely to do a soft first stint, a medium second stint, and a hard tyre for the final stint of a 2-stop race, which was the overall expectation and what I think nearly every car did yesterday as well. At that safety car, we had already 4 or 5 laps previously converted Kimi to a 3-stop. So we had come in, we'd fitted the soft tyre, and really had that safety car come out at the worst possible time, which was just as he was getting into that third stint of the race before then making what would have been his third and final pit stop, again to a set of soft tyres.
Now, Kimi did look like he had a lot of pace in that first stint. Would a different strategy have helped place him firmly into that top 10?
In hindsight, there are two different things we could have done. We could have either, as Ocon did, who we followed into the pits for that second stop, taken the hard tyre, fitted that, and then probably ended up in that sort of 8th, 9th place region with Kimi, so further down than where he qualified, and ultimately that was a legacy of the difficult first lap and then not being able to quite eke out the tyre life as far as some other drivers. Or we could have stayed out on track under the safety car, gained positions knowing we probably still had another pit stop to make, but let him go hell for leather, then box, and then do a whole load of overtaking in the final few laps. So those are two other scenarios that we could have played out. Obviously, strategy is a very, very easy thing in hindsight and a much more difficult thing in the moment. And so we covered the other cars around us, took that soft tyre, and then we're really banking on that soft performing better than the hard tyre that we chose not to run at all in the Grand Prix, and hoping that would allow him to make progress. And they did make some progress, those 3 soft-tyred cars, but ultimately there wasn't enough of a delta between Kimi and Behrman's Haas in front for him to be able to overtake and make relative progress through the field.
I just wanted to touch on something that you said at the beginning there, that we decided, how do we decide how many tires to keep for qualifying and for the race through those free practice sessions?
It's a really delicate balance, and it's a process. It's something we think about long before the race weekend, and already with your first starting tyre in FP1, you're starting to work towards a particular approach in qualifying. We wanted the safety and the security of 5 sets of soft tyres in the qualifying session. We were one of the very few cars to have that, and in fact it paid off for us when we saw what the qualifying positions were, with George second and Kimi fourth, because it gave them 2 goes on new sets of soft in Q3, where other drivers were generally using a used set and then taking a new set. But it left us slightly on the back foot for Sunday. Now, our expectation was that the 3 tyres would be quite closely matched, and actually that the hard tyre probably wouldn't perform brilliantly in those conditions, and I think we saw that borne out as well. But George was able to take a soft, medium, soft strategy and really make that work to good advantage against medium and hard-tired cars around him. And it was unfortunate for Kimi that the safety car fell just at the worst possible time after we'd converted to that 3-stop.
And lastly, our final question starts off with a bit of praise and congratulations for another podium. But how is the team feeling, and any expectations going into Jeddah this week?
I think overall we're feeling pretty good. McLaren are clearly the class of the field right now, and when we looked at performance this weekend in Bahrain compared to, say, winter testing, we were predicting a gap of anything up to a second a lap to McLaren on the long runs, and it was a much smaller gap in the much hotter conditions that we had at the race weekend just gone. So seeing that the car was able to perform in those conditions as it has done in much cooler conditions in Suzuka or in China, that was really reassuring, because it was one of the weak spots that we had last year and something we've really tried to work hard on over the winter. Likewise, seeing the car's consistency of performance across the first very different 4 circuits and 4 races has been really encouraging. George ultimately has had the pace for a podium finish at all 4 of those and delivered that podium at 3 of them. So it's been a really strong start. We stand second in the championship and look like on average we've got the second fastest car at the moment. So that's hugely encouraging. Likewise, we've seen a pretty remarkable sort of first 4 races from Kimi as well, when we were sitting there before Melbourne and trying to sort of calibrate what would the targets look like and what would the objectives be for the first quarter of the season. I don't think any of us quite believed that we might be talking about qualifying top 5 within those first 4 races, finishing P4 in the opening Grand Prix in a sort of very, very tricky, dry, wet, dry race. And I think the composure with which Kimi has stepped into Formula One and begun to perform, but also the determination and the humility with which he's still really focused on learning and honing his craft as well, have been incredibly impressive. So that's really encouraging. And then we head to Jeddah, where we think the car should perform strongly. It rewards a car that the drivers can be confident in, that is stable and composed at high speed through those very, very fast sweeping corners in the first sector. So I think we're very excited about what Jeddah could hold this weekend.
We can't wait. We can't wait to see what happens. Keep the momentum up for Jeddah.
Exactly.
Thank you, Bradley.
Thank you.